Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so very much for joining us today for this amazing session, Rebuild Social Trust, Weaving a New Inclusive Social Fabric. My name is Taisha Ty Wilson. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am the proud Senior Director of Community here at Philanthropy Together, where me and my dynamic team since 2020, y'all, have been growing and strengthening collective giving practices globally and bringing amazing programming to you all like We Give Summit. A quick reminder that closed captioning is always available and will be enabled at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'm just super excited to be here with you all to discuss about this session. Research shows us, y'all, that connected communities are healthier and happier and more resilient after disasters, and yet social trust in the United States is at a 60-year low. So building a web of strong ties, that's why we're here, is the foundation for any community work that aims to promote our social health, equity, and working in a thriving democracy. So this session is going to touch on all of that. And I do feel that DEPA did a wonderful job earlier of really rooting us into this concept of weaving and how we can lean into it, weave relationships and trust by way of our ties. And so we have some dynamic speakers joining us today. This is an interactive session, y'all, so I would encourage you all to please engage as the speakers are inviting you all to, and also be mindful of We Give Summit's community guidelines. And at the end of this session, you can expect that a quick 2-question poll will pop up, so don't leave until you do that so that we can get some good feedback from you all. That being said, I just want to introduce 3 wonderful speakers today that are running this session. We have Shaylyn, Romney, Garrett, who is the co-author of The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. Vanessa, Elias with Thrive with a Guide, and Michael Skoler with the Aspen Institute. And so I'm gonna get out your way. Michael, brother, I'm gonna pass it on to you so we can get into it. Welcome to We Give Summit.
Thank you much, Taisha. Our country is sailing in difficult waters right now. I don't think I have to tell any of you that. We're all feeling it. The Surgeon General has declared that we have an epidemic of loneliness. We know that there's been a huge decline in mental health in our country, that adults, 30% of adults say that they've experienced anxiety and depression. The mental health issues have particularly affected young people. In one survey, 1 in 3 high school girls said that they felt so bad that they had considered suicide at one point, which is an astounding figure. And in general, we have a lack of trust. We have a lack of trust in our institutions, whether that's government or the different forms of government, or whether it's in corporations or in a whole range of kind of different institutions. And in surveys, we've actually found that just 30% of Americans feel that they can reliably trust other Americans, their neighbors. On top of all of the mental and physical and emotional things happening, we've got a social gridlock and political gridlock, which means that we're not able to tackle the many social issues that our country's facing. And we see that when it comes to racial equity, social equity. We see that when it comes to dealing with climate change. We see that in a whole range of issues, pressing problems that we just can't come together and solve in ways that we used to have a more bipartisan, more welcoming approach to. Yet we can solve this problem. And as we'll hear in this session, more than 100 years ago, America was in a similar state of disconnection and isolation and partisanship. And we got out of it. And we'll hear a little bit about how we got out of it and what we can do to get out of it now. Beneath all of these issues that we're suffering from today, I believe there's a root cause, that we've lost trust in each other, that instead of focusing on our common humanity, we're focusing on our differences. And when people feel isolated and disconnected, people tend to get mean. they tend to get tribal and they tend to define themselves by the people they're against rather than looking for what we share. I saw what can happen when the social fabric gets shredded. 30 years ago, I was a young reporter, a young journalist for National Public Radio based in Kenya. And I had heard that genocide had started in Rwanda, and I was one of the first reporters to enter that country. I entered in a caravan of trucks from the American Red Cross. And as we came into Rwanda, we passed these barricades that people had set up to slow cars down so they could check who was in them. And by each barricade, there were piles of bodies. And as we got further into the country, I wandered into a small village and found a church that was quiet, seemed almost abandoned. And I heard that many, many Rwandan families had gone to that church to try to find safety when mobs of neighbors were coming around to kill people. They believed and prayed that their neighbors would respect the sanctity of God's house and wouldn't come in and would come to their senses. When I entered that church, pews were overturned. I saw clothing everywhere. Bodies were everywhere. I later met someone who had survived by hiding up in the rafters and who told me what went on. And I won't talk about the details, but it left a lasting impression of what does happen when our social ties are torn and shredded in such a dramatic way. Yet I also met many Rwandans who refused to join the killing mobs and who hid their neighbors at great risk in their own homes. And many, many whose families, many members of their families were killed who came back into the country to rebuild their communities. And they came back willing to forgive their neighbors, understanding what had happened and how a government had set people against each other. I left journalism 6 years ago and joined the Aspen Institute's Weave the Social Fabric project. It was a project that was started by a fellow journalist, David Brooks, a New York Times columnist and author. And he started it because in all of his reporting, he felt that there were the common theme that he saw, the common problem underneath was this broken trust and this isolation and disconnection. And I joined and left journalism because I feel that the most important thing we can do now in this country is to remind each other of our common humanity and to reweave a strong social fabric that this time includes everyone, all the groups that have been marginalized, and that's the most important work we can do. And that's the work that I think all of us are trying to do. David Brooks recognized that change doesn't start in Washington. Social change happens in the communities. It starts at the neighborhood level. It starts in the relationships we have with each other and how we show up for each other. And social change really does move at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust. Collective giving is all about community. We do that in two ways. We give as a community to maximize our impact, and we also direct our funds and our energy locally to the communities where we live. And so collective giving is and can be an even more powerful force in weaving a new inclusive social fabric. In today's session, we're going to address 3 questions. First, how did our social fabric become so frayed and torn, and can it be repaired? Secondly, how do we weave a new inclusive social fabric? And third, how can collective giving support the people and groups who are doing that weaving? At the end of the session, I'll talk about Weave the Social Fabric Project and what we're doing to support, as a backbone organization, the people all across the country who are trying to weave this nation, heal this nation's divides by starting where they live and building community and caring and belonging from the ground up. Right now, I'm thrilled to be joined in this session by 2 people with tons of knowledge and experience about what it takes to weave our society together again. Shaylyn Romney Garrett has done many things. She's a social entrepreneur who has spent a lot of time researching the importance of community and how to unleash the power of community. She co-authored a recent book with political scientist Robert Putnam called The Upswing: How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And she's been a personal weaver in many different communities all of her life. I met Shaylyn because she was part of the founding of the Weave, the social project, the Social Fabric Project. And she then left to complete the book with Robert Putnam. Shaylyn, your book really was about looking back at this country and saying, we were in this place more than 100 years ago, and we were able to get through it, but a place very similar to now of broken politics, political and social gridlock, of incredible inequity. Um, can you tell me, it's not a new crisis. Are there new solutions, or do we have solutions we can lean on?
Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of people find it surprising. First of all, thanks for having me, Michael, and it's great to be here with you. Of course, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I think um, both been inspired by what we've seen throughout America happening at the community level. But what I want to talk about is not actually the community level first, right? What I want to take is this sort of 30,000 foot view of what's happening in America more broadly, not just today, but what has happened in America over the course of 125 years, because I really believe that if we're going to solve today's problems, we have to understand their roots, right? And anyone who's familiar with my co-author's work, Robert Putnam, knows that he wrote a famous book about 20 years ago called Bowling Alone, in which he identified this sort of crisis of social ties, the decline of social capital in America, and really that all of these measures of community connectedness have been in sharp decline, basically since mid-century, mid-20th century in America. But the question that he and I really came together to answer was, well, if all of these social ties have been in decline for 60, 70 years, what happened before that? What was the first half of that story, right? And when we zoomed the lens out to look at not just the past half century, but the past 100, 125 years in American history, we saw this interesting phenomenon. The first realization from our research was, astonishingly, that we've been here once before. As Michael mentioned, we are at a historic state of political polarization and economic inequality and social isolation and cultural narcissism. And as a result, we hear all of these doomsday prophecies today about plutocracy and tyranny and oligarchy and the American experiment, run amok. And what's so fascinating is when we turn the clock back to the turn of the last century, during the 1880s and 1890s, at a time that historians have called the Gilded Age, by hard measures, America was in the exact same position that we are today. In fact, when you really dig into the statistical and sort of social history of America, it's breathtaking how similar that era was to today. And just like today, people thought that it was that it was hopeless, right? But obviously, the American experiment didn't fail. Those doomsday prophecies were not fulfilled. And so the question is how and why? Why didn't it go off the rails, and how did we right the ship? Because when we look at the data, and we're talking about scores and scores of measures, looking at all different aspects of American society over a very long period of time, what we see is that from that early 20th century period, or even a few years before the turn of the 20th century, we pulled ourselves up and out of that state of despair. And all of those measures that we've mentioned, year upon year, got better and better and better. Now, none of us on this call have ever lived through a period in American history when things were getting better and better and better year upon year, from the standpoint of polarization or the standpoint of inequality or the standpoint of social isolation. We've lived in a period where the opposite has been true. But within living memory, America was moving in a different direction. And so the question of the upswing is, to look at that upswing and ask ourselves, how did Americans right the ship? How did they turn it around? And then also ask the question, what happened in mid-century America to turn it back down the other direction, such that we've landed in the position that we are today, where we're reliving this dark period in American history. And what is so interesting about that story is that, exactly as has been said, the change began in a couple of surprising places. We would think, well, maybe it was a policy initiative. Maybe some political party swept into power that sort of started to change everything on a political and institutional level. The reality is that before our economic inequality started to turn, before our political polarization started to turn, what began to turn first really was our culture. We were living in a very I-focused, self-focused culture at that beginning of the 20th century. And actually, the first metric that began to move in a better direction was our culture. We moved from a state of cultural narcissism to a place of cultural solidarity. We began to question the underlying values that were informing our political systems, that were informing our economic systems. All of these political and economic outcomes were sort of downstream effects of what was happening in our hearts, what was happening in our homes, how we were looking at each other, how we were behaving in our communities at a very local level. And it's interesting because we tend to have this sort of flip-flop view of history that things happen more top down. But the reality of this story, when you really dig into it, is that things began from the bottom up. And there are so many examples of what this looked like on the granular level. But the big message here, the headline message of this story, of all of this data and all of this 30,000-foot view, is that we have been here once before as a nation. Not in a place sort of similar, in a place really, really breathtakingly similar to where we are today. We got ourselves out of it once before, and we can do it again. So that's the first thing that I really hope sinks in, that we've done this once before and we can do it again.
So, Shaylyn, were communities helping lead the innovation that helped the US become more connected in those first 60 years?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Gilded Age, which was this period of despair, much like our own, gave way to a period that historians called the Progressive Era. Now, for clarity's sake, I want to make sure that we're all understanding this is not lowercase p progressivism. Progressive, as we use the term today, is lowercase p, small p progressivism, which describes the leftmost end of the political spectrum, right? But the Progressive Era was capital P Progressive Era. It was a bipartisan movement. It was not ideological. It was a very diverse movement. Historians have called it so diverse as to be barely coherent, actually. But it was a movement that was driven around really turning back toward one another in a time of crisis. And what that looked like was people beginning to solve problems right outside their doorstep. And so some of the biggest innovations that really define America as we know it today, things like the minimum wage, things like child labor legislation, consumer protections, trust busting, all these things that Social Security, right? Things that we tend to think of as sort of defining of what we think of as America really were built during the Progressive Era, but the very roots of those innovations were happening at a very local level. So one really interesting example of this is the high school movement, the public high school movement. We tend to take it for granted that free public high school is available to every American, right? But that didn't exist before the Progressive Era. And we think, okay, well, someone must have invented it. It must have been sort of a policy initiative that came out of Washington or a white paper that came out of Harvard. And suddenly we had this idea that we needed to build public education for the sake of a better economy. That's not the truth. What happened was that people in local communities in small towns in the Midwestern states of America began to look around and realize that the economy had changed, the Industrial Revolution had changed the economy, and that their kids were not prepared to succeed in the economy without a secondary education. But secondary education was really only available for the wealthy. You had to send your kid off to some paid school, which most people couldn't afford. So local communities thought, well, what if we banded together and we passed local tax initiatives that would raise enough money to start a school? So if we all paid a little bit, then all of our kids could have this free public education and all of our kids would succeed in this new economy. And that idea succeeded and it went viral. And all of a sudden, all these little towns all across America were funding their own free public high school. And that eventually bubbled up and became adopted at the municipal level and at the national level. And if you ask an economist today, what one of the biggest drivers of economic growth and economic equality in the whole of the 20th century is, they will say public high schools. And that was invented by communities, by neighbors turning toward one another to solve a big problem rather than turning outside of each other and looking to political parties to come in and be their saviors.
It's exciting to think that there are innovations like that happening in communities today that 10, 20, 30 years from now, we'll look back at and say, where did this come from? And we'll assume it was just always part of society. Really quickly, is there a particular innovation you've seen that coming out of a community recently that seems interesting, unusual?
Well, they didn't pay me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Collective giving is actually really inspiring, right? And it's actually pretty similar to something that happened during the Progressive era. Jane Addams, who founded Hull House, which was the most famous American outpost of something called the Settlement House movement, which ultimately was responsible for things like child labor legislation and public parks and public schools and libraries and all these innovations that we think of as normal today. Her work was initially funded by something called a community chest, which was a coming together of people at the local level to pool their funds in order to fund change in their own community. And that was a really important part of a lot of these sort of grassroots initiatives that ultimately began to change the landscape and push us into that upswing so many years ago. So you guys are on the right team here. And I just want to give you a boost that history shows that what you're doing really works and that it really matters.
That's beautiful. And it does explain where community chest and Monopoly came from. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me turn now to Vanessa Elias. Vanessa knows about disconnection. Vanessa moved, I think, 28 times in her first few decades of life. She is now a mental health activist. She's a certified parent coach. She's a speaker and writer, and she facilitates parent support groups for the National Alliance on Mental Health. So very, very aware of those statistics about the decline in mental health, particularly among young people. She was the leader of the youth council in her town, where she's now settled, of Wilton, Connecticut. Vanessa, your town, your community is suburban. I imagine there are lots of two-car garages and SUVs, and I know you've got good schools, lots of sports for kids. It looks like it's thriving on the outside, but I gather that's not the whole story, and that once you settled in Wilton and really dove deeply into weaving that community, you began to see another side of the story. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, absolutely. Wilton is a place, first of all, thank you for having me. And I'm sorry about my voice. I explained earlier that there was a mouse in my house yesterday, and unfortunately I lost my voice. But it's a place where Wilton is a place where everyone is working so hard to raise their children. This is where you want to raise your family. The schools are great. The neighborhoods are beautiful. It's safe. And the truth is that a lot of these homes, I called them little silos of hell. People are struggling and suffering quietly, and they have extra pressure to feel capable and, that they have an image that they need to keep up. And I tell a story about when I first moved here. A neighbor had, because I did move so many times in states and countries, that I was so happy to be here and settled and have a community and neighborhood. And a neighbor asked to borrow a cup of flour. And I had like all these warm fuzzies inside, bringing my neighbor the cup of flour. Actually, I think she sent her daughter over to get it. And then the next day I came home and there was a bag of flour on my doorstep. And it felt like a slap in the face. And it just felt like no one, and she meant only good by it, but it just felt like no one can owe each other anything. There can't be any sort of interdependence or dependence. We have to be self-sufficient and capable. And I think that's an extra pressure. And we'd actually moved back to the US because of one of our children's mental health needed more support, and we needed to find resources. And that's one of the reasons we moved here. And in the years prior, I struggled silently in our home. And so when I moved here, I decided that I was going to be vulnerable and be brave and talk about things. And as a result, people would quietly come to me asking for help and guidance, and appreciate that someone was talking about this finally, their child's mental health. And the Pew Research had a study done that showed that children actually raising in an affluent, community, being in a high achieving school, was actually a tremendous risk factor for depression, suicidality, substance use, along the, even higher actually than trauma and poverty. And that is a real shock to a lot of people. And so by talking about it, other people felt safe talking about it. And it allowed us to change the conversation and to give people voice and a safe space to talk about this. I started a group in town. It's actually a national organization, NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness. And so a monthly parent support group for parents whose kids struggle. And it helped me, even as my own family was struggling, to feel like I could make a difference and to be a light in someone else's darkness. And as part of my work with the Youth Council, as a community leader during the 2016 elections, there was tremendous civility issues, well, across the country, but in our town. There were some anti-Semitic notes in a middle school. There were horrendous politicians brought people together, community leaders together, talk about the problems we were having. And one of the things I found out is that our local politicians, when they received an email from someone, or when someone commented on Facebook, it was full of vitriol and really aggressive. But when they met the person in person, they had an entirely different experience. So I really realized we were missing that face-to-face connection. And so knowing about kids' mental health and the lack of free play they were having, the lack of agency, I started this idea of block parties in our community. We've had our first one in 2018 with the two-pronged goal of connecting neighbors face to face and providing opportunities for neighborhood free play for children, because connection is the cornerstone of human happiness. And doing that in my own community, the first time we had about 40 different block parties happening at the same time with about 1,200 participants. And the importance of this, when I talk about block parties, it's not like a town-wide block party with hundreds of people. It is a micro local get together. So some people say, I don't have a block. Well, your street or your neighbors within 10 miles or your building or your apartment. And when we did it, there were I have so many impact stories of what had happened. And now that it's a tradition, other people have shared. But one of the most powerful things was our neighbor who voted differently than my husband. And we came together at our block party. There had been no contact, no communication, and they bonded over smoked meats. And a relationship grew from that. And it just teaches over and over again that we have more in common, our humanity, than we are different. And so, and people, anyway, I could go on.
Yeah, no, clearly it's a passion, but block parties. Why block parties? That seems too simple as a solution to some of our issues. Clearly you've done more than block parties. Where does it go?
So block parties there's a ripple effect with block parties. So it's, first of all, having this framework because people want to connect. People are hurting inside. They want to be together, but they need like social permission to be able to do that. They feel strange or awkward, or they're going to feel judged by someone. Who's this weirdo asking me, putting a note in my mailbox asking to get together. And so the framework of having this block party allowed people to take that first step and get together. So that's the first thing. Then the ripple effect is the stories I've heard, help. I mean, with the environmental changes we're having, when trees are down and power is out and floods and the environmental, plus jobs for teenagers, meal trains for new moms, it just goes on, and it becomes, you feel more grounded in your own space. And having, again, micro locally is really important. And the other things that we can do, I started, it was 8 years ago, something called Women of Wilton. And I did it organized it on a Facebook page. And the whole point was simply just to create monthly get-togethers for women in our town. There were no obligations to volunteer. There was no jewelry being sold. There was no other. The only point was to connect, because as primary caregivers, we neglect our own well-being. And as Sunya Luther showed us, the number one predictor of a child's well-being is their primary caregiver's well-being and resilience. So if we take time out for ourselves, as this, just organizing. And the key part of all this is having a host, because people feel awkward and they need introductions and so I always feel like I'm hosting a party no matter where I go. So but it makes people feel comfortable. And that's the primary thing. So many people want it, but there is something holding them back. The other piece is name tags. I'm a huge fan of name tags. It makes it so much easier. I always joke that we should all walk around with name tags on, because it's often, if we're like, oh, I should know their name, I've met them before, it's like a little barrier to connection. So always, when you do anything, having name tags there is really important.
So I think part of the message that we're hearing from you, and I think part of the message of this session, is that often the simple things that seem like they're too simple actually help reweave the social fabric in a way that could make larger things happen. And I want to go directly. I was planning a couple other questions for you too, but I want to go directly to a question that we've gotten from Viv Tran, and we often get this question, that it's wonderful to talk about communities and building trust and individual interpersonal relationships, but isn't our real problem the institutions? How do we hold institutions as accountable as we hold communities? Don't we need to do something on a larger scale than just start weaving where we live? And Shaylyn, I'll start with you on this one, since again you've looked at a vast array of time and institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I feel with my heart like the energy of that question, right? But I am going to push against it a little bit, right? Because the question is, how do we hold anything accountable without collective action? And how do we do collective action if we don't know each other's names? So it seems like we need to skip over to the important stuff, right? Of doing the accountability work on an institutional level. And I don't disagree with that at all. But what I'm trying to say is, and I think what Vanessa's trying to say is too, is how do we get there, where we can all agree about who needs to be held accountable and in what way are we going to hold them accountable if we're not actually in human scale relationship with one another. And I just want to emphasize, like these stories of the progressive era, they follow exactly the trajectory of what Vanessa is describing, right? So we think of the settlement house movement, which ultimately held big business accountable in a massive way. It held big business accountable for exploiting children on the factory line. But how did it actually start? It started with a woman named Jane Addams, who recognized that she was a wealthy white woman who didn't know anything about these waves of new immigrants that were coming into her city. She lived on the other side of town from them. She'd never spoken to them. She didn't know anything about them. So she decided to literally just pick up and plant herself in a different neighborhood and to engage in what she called neighborliness. Her intention was to build a nation of neighbors. That was her organizing intention for what she did. And what grew out of that were these massive social changes that ultimately won her. She was the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize for the grand scale on which she affected our society by holding institutions accountable. But it started by going and learning the names of people who were not like her and listening to them and creating relationship on a human scale. That is how it works. And we're so impatient for change that we want to skip that part because it seems hard. And actually, it seems culturally awkward. Vanessa's absolutely right. We can measure this, that the reason people feel awkward is because we are swimming in a culture that says I is more important than we. And that means that I have to be self-sufficient. And it means that I value my privacy and I value your privacy. And that's what we do. So the real change makers in this society are going to be those people who are brave enough to do the radical act of going and knocking on their neighbor's door and saying, hi, I'm Shaylyn. Who are you? Let's be friends.
Vanessa, any thoughts on that issue of starting at the community level rather than going right after the institutions and the systems that block us?
Absolutely, because guess who we have power over? Ourselves. Like, we are the ones, we have control over what we do. So let's focus on what we can do right here. And it doesn't mean we're not also trying somewhere else. Okay. It's not an and, or it's not an or, it's an and. And so starting with that which we can control and making connections and learning, and it strengthens. I mean, all the book, Fragile Neighborhoods, you know, talking about how the importance of the neighborhood and how it, you know, everything that you talked about already. So starting at the neighborhood, and being able to make the changes on the institutional level.
I'll also add that, you know, one of the big issues, one of the reasons we're in such political and social gridlock, you know, major things happen. George Floyd gets murdered, and, you know, there's an outrage, and we hear a lot about it, but real change doesn't happen, is because we live in a culture where, rather than seeing our common humanity, we're dehumanizing others. And a lot of our issues happen when we stop seeing people as people, and we make people into objects. And so a lot of this community weaving, this social fabric weaving that needs to be done, is to get us to a place where we see each other fully. And when we see each other fully, amazing things happen. We see problems in different light, and we create solutions, you know, whether it's settlement houses or public high schools or a million other things. So again, on a certain level, how we show up does matter. And the change we want to see has to start there, as we've just been saying, and kind of move from there. We have another question that, again, is always worrisome, which is, you know, now we have mobile communications where we officially are always connected, but in many ways not connected. We have social media that, again, claims to connect us all, but in many ways actually distances us. You know, how do we cope with, and what role do all of the new technical innovations play in weaving or not weaving, and what do we do about it? Vanessa, do you have some thoughts? I know you've dealt a lot with youth mental health, and that's almost a canary in the coal mine for a lot of these things, technology.
It really is. And technology is not entirely good or entirely bad. Look at this, what we're doing here today. This wouldn't be possible without technology and how we reach people. And technology, the goal of a lot of these social media platforms is to draw you in, and they do it. What you suddenly see is only one story. So you only get fed certain things. You go down these little rabbit holes. So two people that can enter in keywords into their Google search who have different political views will see different results. They're not the same. So it's shaping how we see other people or not see other people more appropriately. So technology definitely plays a role. That's why block parties are important. It is that face-to-face interaction and connection that can make the difference in conversation. And we mistake Facebook for places to have conversation, especially the adults, that we have conversations. You don't, it's not the village center that we all think it is. It really needs to be face to face.
Let me ask this question. If in this discussion, some of us have become convinced that indeed, you know, weaving is a critical part of getting us out of the dark place that we're in now in this country that Shaylyn studied. Let me ask Vanessa and Shaylyn, how can people who are in giving circles or interested in community work, how can they find and support the people doing this weaving, showing up for others in a very vulnerable and open and accepting way? How do we find those folks? What are the signs of the groups that are doing this work? Vanessa, do you want to start on that?
Sure. I mean, I think both philanthropy together with the circles and the Weave social fabric project are amazing at bringing the people that are making change together. Because that's an important piece, because a lot of us feel like we're alone in this. We can be lonely in our efforts, and it's what a beautiful environment to be inspired by what other people are doing. Like, you're seeing all the amazing work that people are doing in this world, and that's really inspiring. Now, I think on a local level, it's just putting the invitation out there. It's asking, being the leader, and getting people together that way, and you know, always assuming good, assuming people have the best intentions with something, and helping people see the gray. We are very black and white. And so the importance of the and in this. So, you know, just bringing people together to give them an opportunity to connect.
Shaylyn, there is a difference between serving people and caring for people and weaving. There are many, many groups that are busy, feeding the hungry, finding housing for the homeless, all wonderful acts of caring. But when we talk about weaving, we talk about something that almost goes a step beyond caring, and that has an element of seeing the mutual dignity in people. Sometimes caring for others and charity, David Brooks likes to say charity is often a dirty word to weavers. Charity has a power dynamic in it. I'm privileged, you're not, I need to help you. Whereas weaving shows up with a mutuality. How do you notice the groups that show up with that mindset of weaving community and not just serving those in need?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the settlement house movement, if you can't tell, happens to be one of my favorite social movements of all time. And I actually wrote my undergraduate thesis about the settlement house movement, and actually about how the character of what was happening at the neighborhood level changed when the funding structure changed. And over time, the settlement house movement was sort of pressured to move in toward a service provision model, where we needed to be a service provider to meet all of these needs in the community. And I visited settlement house movements, many of which are alive and well today, and settlement houses, many of which are alive and well today. And what they are is a big building with a window and a receptionist sitting at the front, and you come in to get your services, right? And there is no sense of gathering. There is no sense of humanity, right? But these are important institutions. Like, we can't do without them, because they actually fill a gap when we're not caring for each other. But I do think it's, we need to look for organizations that are bringing people together on a whole human level. And that's what's so beautiful about something like a block party, right? Like, we're not just gathering around an interest area. We're not just gathering around a need. We're not just gathering around an issue that we all share, that we want to be active on. We are just gathering around the fact that we share physical space. And that's going to bring a whole bunch of issues in, and that's going to bring a whole bunch of needs in. And it's also going to bring in some really organic ways that we can meet each other's needs, rather than like referring someone out to a mental health counselor. Well, maybe I can just be a listening ear, which might be all that somebody needs. This happened to me just this week. I know we're out of time, but there's a woman down the street from me who I have been trying to connect with for 2 years. She has kids the same age as mine, and they don't ever come out of their house. And just 2 weeks ago, I saw her daughter on the street, and I stopped the car and I said, "Hey," I said, "guess what? Did you know that we're raising some baby chicks in our backyard? Do you want to come and meet the baby chicks?" And it was like, "Oh, yes." And all of a sudden, the mom was out, the mom was talking to me. And before I even barely knew her name, this whole story had tumbled out about her son's mental health needs, and about how, she feels overwhelmed and isolated. And it was just like, all of a sudden, there was a place for her kids to go down the street to play when she needed a break. All of a sudden, there was another human being that she could talk to. And it just, because we were neighbors. And so look I don't know, those things don't need funding. That's the other thing that I want to emphasize, right? And so if we want to be influencers, we need to think not just about how our dollars can support things. We need to think about how our actions can change our culture. And that, to me, is something that I'm even more passionate about than asking the question of how we channel our financial resources.
And I will add, so that we do get to a higher, a kind of larger level, there are some weaving efforts that have started in places like Shreveport, Louisiana, the Community Renewal International, where some white people went into a Black neighborhood that had been ignored for a really long time, and they were not welcomed, but they just kept showing up. And over time, they got to know some of the kids, and then the parents started coming out of the houses, and that's led to this huge movement of 50,000 people that are now working across race, across social class, to make Shreveport stronger. And they're doing it by creating community friendship houses where people can gather, safe places for kids after school. But one of the things they found in Shreveport was that, the people living in wealthy neighborhoods were just as lonely, maybe more lonely than some of the people in the lower income neighborhoods, and wanted to be connected as well as, and offer what they could offer from their resources, to feel connected and to feel like the community was a strong, striving community. So there are these things can add up to big movements that do begin, Viv, to your point, that do begin to help dismantle a white supremacist culture that has been in place for a long time and needs dismantling and takes time to dismantle. But again, the relationships are the ways that we begin to change the hearts and minds. We only have time for one other quick question, and I want to really bring this back to giving circles. For those people who are in giving circles, how do you build trust yourself through the giving circles, not just with members, but also with the groups that you support, and also with other groups and people? Are there some ways that the giving circles themselves can become kind of units of weaving, not just providing the funds that you were talking about, Shaylyn? Shaylyn, you have a quick thought on that, and then we'll need to wrap up. Really quick.
I think, and I'm sure that this is something that these communities talk about a lot, so I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I would say not showing up with an agenda, right? Showing up with a desire to listen and learn what is needed and wanted. And I think that, that's just something that I think we talk about a lot in these communities, but it's worth repeating, that innovations emerge when we listen to one another and we bring what we have to offer and we bring it into conversation with what other people have to offer, and together we create something wonderful, rather than coming in and seeing a deficit and a resource to meet a need and trying to negotiate that conversation. To just come into a collaborative space and let solutions emerge with resources coming together on equal plane is really the goal, I think.
Great. And Vanessa, closing thought on how the folks in this call can start thinking of themselves as weavers in their collective giving.
Absolutely. You have the power to be a well-being catalyst, and it is really gratifying to do. It changes your life. And so the whole point of the block party is to be simple and doable and actionable. We don't need to wait or wring our hands out with what can we do. And so I ask all of you to start organizing your block party for this summer today.
Thank you both very much. Weave, the Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute, was created to support the people who are weaving their communities and to inspire all of us to become weavers in small and big ways. Social change requires, as we've been talking about, not just a change in our institutions and in our systems, but it requires a change of hearts and minds. And that's something that we really can do in our communities. The Weave Project has three main ways to learn more and connect with others interested in the weaving community. First, we have a weekly newsletter that tells stories of what people are doing in different communities around the country. And we highlight resources and grants and fellowships for people who are doing weaving work. And it's also just a place to get ideas in many ways and to meet remarkable people. You can meet people virtually in our second form, which is we have an online Weave community of about 1,500 people now across the country. And people gather for peer support and peer learning. You can learn skills like grant writing and public speaking and facilitating groups in a learning center in the online Weave community. It's a wonderful place to kind of keep your energy up and to meet people who might be collaborators or just thought partners or just a friendly ear when you get discouraging, because it can be tough to do this work, and people find a lot of solace in the online Weave community. Third, we've started something called the Weaver Network for organizations that are doing this work, and the Weaver Network is a way to move volunteerism to be more than just labor, free labor, to being an active way to bring people together and to create relationships. And if you know of groups in your community that are looking for volunteers and are doing this work of building trust and relationship, urge them to go to the Weaver Network and register their organizations and post their jobs. And we'll be doing a major campaign starting in just a few weeks that'll drive people to the Weaver Network to look at opportunities where they can start weaving community. The quickest way to find all of this and to learn more about us and other things that we do is to go to weavers.org. That's weavers.org. And come and meet other people. We're a backbone organization. We're not about presenting our own programs. We're about supporting the people doing this work. Thank you so much for participating today.
OMG, Michael, Shaylyn, and Vanessa, thank y'all so very much. I don't know if y'all I know you've been looking at the chat, but it's been on fire with amazing comments and interactions and questions. And I just want to take 1 minute to give y'all the opportunity to save the chat. Michael just shared, he shared 3 ways in how beyond this summit that we can activate together and lean into our ties, y'all. So there's some very important links in there, including Shaylyn's book that I shared earlier. So y'all capture the chat, save it, and really connect it, click on it, so we can make sure that y'all stay connected and continue to engage in this conversation, which was so inspiring to me. It was so hard for me to stay on mute. So thank y'all so much for lending your expertise and time. We appreciate your valuable insight. We're gonna pull up this poll real quick. Can y'all do us a favor? Go ahead and fill out this 2-question poll before you exit this meeting. The session for this, the recording for this session, fortunately, is recorded, which is amazing. I'm gonna go back and watch it myself. It'll be up in a couple of days. And shout out to, who was our raffle winner? Angela. Was it Angela? Yes, Angela Fuji. You're a raffle winner, girl. So make sure you click on that link that I DM'd you so that you can claim your book of choice and share your mailing details. But thank you all again for joining us for such an inspiring conversation. We're all are weavers and we're in this together and all the things. We love y'all and we look forward to seeing you at the next session, which is Inspire Culture Change, Movement Building Strategies from Feminist Funds. That starts right now at like 2 p.m. So take a potty break or get your water and all that, and we'll see you all at the next session. Thank you so much.